Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March 3rd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's loaded Saturday of stakes racing, starting with the Saudi Cup in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, then moving on to Gulfstream Park, where they ran a whole slew of stakes races at every division, topped by the Grade 2 Fountain of Youth, one of the major Derby preps. We'll talk about the ramifications of that race, and we'll close out the show by visiting a few other venues, Oaklawn Park, Fairgrounds, and Santa Anita, to discuss the stakes action from all of those places around the country. Craig, I know I missed you on Friday when we did the TimeformUS forecast. Happy to have you back today, though.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. I haven't said much to people, but I have a daughter who's pretty sick and in the hospital, but she's doing much better. So she's still in, but hopefully on the improve and should be coming home soon. So should be back on a more normal schedule.
I'm really glad to hear that. I've been keeping her in my thoughts and hoping things stay on the right path there. So glad to have you back, Craig, and glad things are going better there. Let's start out with that race from halfway around the globe in Saudi Arabia, as Maximum Security topped a bunch of American horses, some of the top U.S. horses in the country that traveled over there for this Saudi Cup to take a stab at that $20 million purse. It was an eventful race, just watching it from a trip standpoint for Maximum Security, because Mucho Gusto proved to be a real pesky foe for him throughout. But Maximum Security just seems to always keep finding more when Luis Saez asks for it, and he gutted out the victory here.
Yeah, I think gutted out is the perfect term, because he really did. He was under a drive for quite a while, and turning for home, I thought he might be beaten. And then with Mucho Gusto, I don't know how you want to characterize the ride, but I think there was a little attempt at some blocking or some herding. And when he dove inside, he just seemed to get even more stronger coming to the lane and dug in and was able to hold off the filly Midnight Bisou, and just a really good effort from him. I'm not even going to think about trying to make a figure for this race, in case anybody's wondering. I'm going to rely on whatever our partners at Timeform come up with. I certainly don't have any problems with their work. They do a really good job, but just based on the replays and the video, it's not great. There's no fractions. So I think they would be able to do a better job here than I would.
Yeah, I did see on Twitter that the Timeform rating for this race was a 130, which if you're familiar with those Timeform ratings in Europe, that's a good, solid Grade 1 race. So they rated this race pretty highly, and it's no surprise because the top American dirt horses did come over for this race. You could say what you will about the visual impression of Maximum Security, kind of, as we said, gutting it out or grinding it out through the lane to get by Mucho Gusto, but he ran hard every step of the way, even though the end of the race wasn't that impressive. I mean, throughout the race, you could even see coming down the backstretch, it was apparent they were moving pretty fast. I saw some people on Twitter saying that they were trying to time the race from video. The fractions, were 45, 46. I didn't see what they were, but fast for a mile and an eighth. And Maximum Security was being asked throughout to keep up with that hot pace, and he just kept finding more. Midnight Bisou, she got the right trip, and she was able to avoid all of those drifting tactics on Mucho Gusto by staying down on the rail. She came up the inside to get a piece of it. An admirable performance by her. She's another one that just always shows up with her top effort, and she did so here. It sounds like neither of these top two finishers will move on to the Dubai World Cup, which I'm not too upset about. I'll be happy to see them racing back in the United States.
Yeah, it's I would think 2 races over there would probably be a while before we see him. So I'm kind of glad. From a selfish standpoint, I like when our horses race here, not so much overseas. Not faulting the connections at all for that kind of money. It's certainly their decision and completely understandable. But again, from my view of things, I want to see him here because I'm a fan of American racing. I do want to say Midnight Bisou. Wow, that was some effort. Of the American horses, she was the one I wasn't particularly fond of in here, but I would argue she probably ran the best race of her career.
Yeah, she really did. I mean, I wasn't sure that she'd be good enough to step up against these male horses, and some things did work out for her, but she also showed up and ran the race. So very exciting to have her back in this filly and mare division when she returns to the U.S. to race as a 6-year-old. Or 5-year-old, rather. She's 5 now. Yeah.
Yes.
Getting 1 year ahead of myself. All right, let's move back to the United States and go down to Gulfstream Park, where we're going to stay for most of this show. As I mentioned at the top, they ran the Fountain of Youth, 50 points on the line towards the winner of this race, and that winner was Ete Indian. This is a horse, well, I know that you were a fan of going back to earlier this winter. He couldn't quite hold off Tiz the Law and the Holy Bull, but without Tiz the Law in this race and nobody else really stepping up to the challenge, Ete Indian just dominated these.
He did, and I want to give hats off to Florent Giroux. He rode the horse exactly how you have to ride from an outside post at Gulfstream. He was very aggressive. He took the lead. He wasn't worried that he was going quick. He made sure he got good position. Our pace figures early were 139 for the half mile and 125 for 6 furlongs. So while it's not quite enough to be coded red in our past performances, it was certainly honest, and even it has to be right on the borderline. I never remember the exact numbers, but it didn't matter because after that, he just kept running away from the field. I did think there were a couple tougher trips in here. I thought Shotsky did not get that aggressive ride, so he kind of wound up getting hung wide on both turns. And I thought he ran okay. As seen on TV, was in traffic most of the way, a trip I'm never a fan of. But in the end, Ete Indian was just the best horse. I mean, he won by 8.5 lengths, and his 120 TimeformUS speed figure is the best that we've seen on the Triple Crown Trail so far.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I thought that was the case, that the 120 was the highest we've seen. I know Dennis's Moment ran a higher figure in a maiden race back last year, but I think of the horses in this class, that 120 is right up there as one of the top figures in a stakes race at the very least. And based on this effort, it seems like Ete Indian even improved out of the Holy Bull last time. Seems like he's just really firing on all cylinders right now for Patrick Biancone, who just seems to have this turf to dirt move really perfected, because he did the same thing with Sol Volante, and he was so good in the Sam F. Davis. He's got a really nice complementary duo with this front runner and that closer, so it'll be interesting to see how they progress on the Derby Trail for him. As for the others in here, I don't have a whole lot to say about the horses that finished directly behind Ete Indian. I mean, I guess you're right that As Seen on TV had some traffic. I was really hoping to see more from him, though. I mean, the fact that Candy Tycoon got up for second, I think, is a bit of an indictment of the rest of the field, because while Candy Tycoon was expected to be a good horse at one time, he had been running the fastest races against Maiden Company recently. I mean, the other horse that we really have to discuss is Dennis's Moment. Just what happened? I mean, where does he go from here?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I did look it up while you were talking. He actually ran a 118 when he broke his maiden, so not quite as fast as this one was. I think Tiz the Law ran a 119 when he was beating Ete Indian. And, I mean, these are horses we expect to improve as the year goes on. They're lightly raced and developed, and developing. As far as Dennis's Moment goes, I'm not sure. I had seen some people talking. There were two camps that he looked really strong, and in one, and on the other that even despite his troubles in the juvenile, he basically did no running whatsoever, and people were concerned with that. And, you know, it's hard to argue that wasn't the case that day, because basically he did no running whatsoever here either.
Yeah, I mean, I like to judge things for myself. And when I was handicapping this race, I was watching some of his workouts on the XB TV coming up to this race, and I wasn't too impressed. He had Tammy Fox aboard, who's as light an exercise rider as you can put up on horse, and he was really still struggling to get by his workmates in the drills that I saw. So I know Dale Romans was projecting a lot of confidence coming into the race. To me, that didn't really jibe with the visuals that I was seeing in his preparations for this race. But sometimes trainers just project a lot of confidence no matter what the circumstances are. Yeah, I don't know. He was at a horse with more than a half mile to go in this race. So it's more than just the trip not working out or rider tactics. Something's changed with this horse since last year. So, I mean, I don't know if Dale Romans can turn him around from this point, but this is not the same horse that we saw running last summer and fall.
No, it's not. And from what I read in DRF, it looks like they're still planning on going on the Derby Trail. And at this point, he's a horse I would be hard against until he shows something different, because he just showed nothing. And that's 2 races in a row. And it does make you have to wonder what's going on.
Well, we saw the lows of the game for Dale Romans in the Fountain of Youth, and the highs of the game just 2 races earlier in the Gulfstream Park Mile, as his 4 or 5-year-old colt, Mr. Freeze, just really stepped forward in this race. I mean, he had shown some promise in some Grade 1 events going back to last year in the Clark, and then again this year early on in the Pegasus World Cup. We talked about how the Pegasus World Cup this year wasn't the strongest edition of that race, but Mr. Freeze did hold on well to be second that day behind Mucho Gusto. Cutting back to the mile here, though, it really intensified his speed, and he was just in a different class than these horses.
He was. He got a 1:30 TimeformUS speed figure for the race, which is really good for what we've been seeing. I don't even think Mucho Gusto ran that in the Pegasus. I think he was just a hair below that. It was a one-turn mile, which I think is a perfect distance for him. He got a good, solid pace in the race, and he was able to track, something we haven't seen a whole lot of from him before, and I think that's always a good sign. And he just ran really well. He wasn't beating a super strong field. Fat Man ran second. He's a good solid horse, but probably more a Grade 2, Grade 3 type. But I think Mr. Freeze proved that Pegasus was a pretty strong race. When we say it wasn't as strong as some other Pegasus, I don't really think that's an indictment on the race. I mean, we've seen some real superstars win that race. I think it was just a really good, strong Grade 1, probably not up to the previous editions, but it's not going to surprise me if it proves to be a key race the rest of the year.
Yeah, and the thing about Mr. Freeze's performance in this race was they didn't go that fast for the first quarter mile, but he really picked up the pace as they exited the backstretch around the far turn. And when you're watching the race, you could see how he was just easily moving past those two leaders, one of which, Bodie Express, faded all the way back to last in this race. And he just made everybody else come off the bridle with about 3/8 of a mile to go. And while horses didn't close from way back, I mean, Fat Man and Hog Creek Hustle did close from mid-pack in this race to get up for second and third. And Mr. Freeze just he was just in another class than these horses. I think after this, a race like the Met Mile has to really be the target for him, because that seems like the spot where he can get that Grade 1 victory. That's the perfect distance for him. We'll see how far he ultimately wants to go. I don't know if he's going to continue to be a Grade 1 type of horse, going a mile and an eighth, a mile and a quarter. I still think those distances might be a little bit far for him, but he's an exciting one-turn horse. The mile seems like it's the right distance.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, he's definitely moving in the right direction. That's 2 lifetime tops in a row that he's run. And it's not really a surprise when you see these 5-year-olds stick around and suddenly get good. They develop. This is especially on dirt. I know we're going to talk about Zulu Alpha here in a little bit, but on dirt, 5 years old seems to be the peak. If we see horses there, they really reach their absolute best. And, you know, he's a horse. He had some promise as a 3-year-old. Then he obviously had some issues for a lot of his 4-year-old year, but he's had that time to develop. Whatever woes he had, he's obviously recovered from, and now we're seeing the potential that he showed in its full splendor.
Let's stay at that 1 mile distance on the dirt and talk about the 3-year-old fillies that I'll be pointing towards the Kentucky Oaks. And I think we saw 2 legitimate Kentucky Oaks contenders in this Grade 2 Davona Dale, which they ran a little bit earlier in the card at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. Tonalist Shape, I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong, and I was wrong about this horse. I thought she was beating much weaker competition. I wasn't that impressed with some of her prior races. She had run a little bit slower than her main rival, Spice is Nice. But Tonalist Shape, she got a good trip here, but didn't matter. She was best anyway. She was up to the challenge, and she just beat Spice is Nice fair and square.
She did. I was in the same boat as you. She hadn't run particularly fast at all, despite winning pretty easily. And I'm still going to continue to take a shot against these kind of horses because they don't all step up like she did. But the fact is, some of them do, because horses race to win, not to run fast figures. And when they're winning easy, sometimes it does mean that they have more if needed. Sometimes it doesn't. And she obviously proved to be the one that did. She jumped from a 95 TimeformUS speed figure her last time out to a 110 here. So she did what she had to do. And Spice is Nice actually improved a point over her really impressive maiden win where she ran a 107 that day. She got a 107 for this effort. This is another, like I mentioned with the horse from the Fountain of Youth that I'd seen on TV. I'm not terming it a bad trip, but it was a trip where she was in traffic pretty much the whole way around both it was a one-turn race, right? Yeah, just around the turn, but down the back stretch and around the one turn. So, you know, I like to see a little breather in there somewhere that she didn't get. So I'm not going to write her off. I thought they both ran well. And even Dream Marie, who was back in third, took a big jump up to a 103 TimeformUS speed figure. And she seems one who might appreciate a little more extra distance too.
Yeah, I think the big difference in this race between Tonalist Shape and Spice is Nice was just the experience. Tonalist Shape, I mean, she got the right trip, but she also ran a totally professional race. Whereas Spice is Nice, I mean, she did have a little bit of traffic on the backstretch, but I thought John Velasquez got her into the clear with plenty of time to run down Tonalist Shape. And once he did get her into the clear, he was asking her, and she just wasn't really going anywhere. She was just kind of going up and down at the quarter pole. And it wasn't until the final eighth of mile that Spice is Nice really leveled off and was drawing away from Dream Maria and was really getting to Tonalist Shape at the end of this race. Spice is Nice. I mean, just watching these two horses come down the stretch, they're very different physical types. Tonalist Shape looks like a real lean athlete, whereas Spice is Nice is kind of this bigger, bulkier horse that gives me the impression she's going to be one that really wants to go distances like a mile and an eighth around 2 turns. We'll see where they go next if they split off in different directions. But I would imagine both of these horses will wind up in the Kentucky Oaks because based on this race, they're as fast as anybody else that's out there.
They are. And as you said, that what really caught my eye with Spice is Nice is the way she really leveled off late. Turning for home, I was kind of like, oh, maybe she's not really that good. And it just seemed like she was floundering a bit and wasn't going to do any running. But there was definitely a visible cue that she finally figured it out and put her head down and started running. So, again, both of these two are promising for me. I think Tonalist Shape 110 is just a point or two below the best we've seen. And Spice is Nice, obviously, just a couple more points, and she's clearly got room to develop. So I do want to see him around 2 turns, but definitely a strong race for the 3-year-old fillies.
We saw some more of the top horses in the country on display in the Grade 2 Mac Diarmida, which was run just before the Fountain of Youth. These are the turf marathoners, and Zulu Alpha, I think he's really stamped himself at this point as the leader of this turf division. He won the Pegasus World Cup turf in a bit of an upset, got a great trip that day. He got a great trip again in this race, a different kind of trip, but again, the right trip for the race, given the way that it was run. But still, he delivered. He's now won these 2 in a row, and he's just beating solid fields, and I don't see anybody else out there that's achieved this kind of consistency.
No, he really impressed me with this race. And trust me, I know everybody wanted to remind me he had a rabbit in the race. That was pretty obvious. We had a horse run off, open up by a pretty big lead, set a fast pace. All our fractions are in red. So, yeah, maybe he benefited a little bit, but he just swooped the field like they were standing still. It was pretty obvious to me as they were on the turn that he was going to win the race. And I was just really impressed with him. It's quite a move. I love that he's a 7-year-old. I mentioned the 5-year-old thing on dirt. It seems turf, you can even go longer. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's at his, well, he is at his best right now, but if he could maintain it for a while, because we often see that you don't have to run as hard on turf for as long. So maybe that helps with the age thing, but I was just really impressed. He got a 128 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. The runner-up at Mission Office got a 127. Then there was a bit of a gap back to Sadler's Joy. And I don't want to make light of it. There were definitely some trips in this race, but despite those, I still think Zulu Alpha was winning under any conditions.
Yeah, that's the point that I was going to make, because you could watch the run from about the 3/8 pole to the 3/16 pole a bunch of times and make the case that Zulu Alpha got the best trip because Tyler Gaffalione did the right thing by getting him into the clear, knowing the pace was just about to collapse in front of him, and he kept him outside of all those horses. So he was able to make that impressive rush from 8th place up to 1st at about mid-stretch, whereas Sadler's Joy and Channel Maker, they got caught in behind those tiring speed horses, and Channel Maker in particular was in position to pounce and just had to really slam on the brakes at about the quarter pole, had to regather himself. Sadler's Joy, he's the kind of horse that needs to make one big rush, and Javier Castellano got him into a drive at about the 7th or 5/16 pole, and then had to stop and then come out and start again because he got caught in behind those tiring horses. Were they going to finish better than 3rd anyway? Probably not, because the top 2 did win did finish 1st and 2nd with such a margin back to 3rd. But still, I don't think the gap is quite as big as the final margins might suggest between 1st and 4th here. Still, though, Zulu Alpha won. He's now won 2 in a row. Going back to even last year, we haven't seen too many of these turf marathoners winning 2 major races in a row. That was really some of the problems with the Eclipse Award voting behind Bricks and Mortar. There was no clear other horse out there because nobody had won more than 1 race. Well, now Zulu Alpha has, and we'll see if he can continue it.
Yeah, it was good, and like you said, it's a good point you make about the trips. The margins can be deceptive, especially when horses have to restart like this, and that's what makes handicapping turf races fun and often profitable if you're good at it. So I wasn't making light, and I know you know that, but definitely some trips in the race, and I'm not faulting anybody for looking at them. That's how you make money at the windows. I just wanted to make the point that Zulu Alpha, I think, was best regardless.
I cannot argue with that. Another horse who seemed to be best in a graded stakes race on turf, it's on Saturday at Gulfstream Park, was Sambier in the Canadian turf. This horse was put in a sort of difficult position because his stablemate, Guido, just completely ran off on the front end, as Guido is wont to do. We've seen him do this in many races. John Velasquez on this occasion made no attempt to rate him, and he ran sprint-like fractions on the front end. And Sambier got that kind of trip where he was chasing this loose on the lead horse, had to make the first move into that very hot pace, and he still was able to hold off the closer. So I'm not going to argue with anybody who says that Sambier was just the best horse in this race. And I never liked him that much. I never thought he was more than just a decent high-level allowance horse, but he's really stepped forward now as a 4-year-old.
He has, and we weren't impressed with the 3-year-old crop last year. And to this point, I don't think we've seen many beat older horses since they turned 4, but he certainly did it here. And I'm totally with you. I really thought he ran even better than the trip would make. He only won by half a length, but it was not an easy trip. If you look at the horses behind him, they were all much further back in the field, and the other speeds were just nowhere. Not that he was particularly a speed horse, but as you said, he was a chaser in here. He got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, and despite that half-length margin, I do think he was the best horse in here.
Now, we've got to discuss Guido, because I said after the race that Guido was the best horse in the race, and I guess I'm walking that back a little bit, but I don't think there's any denying that Guido perhaps showed the most natural talent of anybody in this race. It's just, what does that mean moving forward? And what has it ever meant moving forward with this horse? Because he's just unrateable. I mean, you can try to get him off the pace. That doesn't seem to work too well. They just let him roll on the front end. He can't really get to the lead in sprint races. In these route races, he goes way too fast and collapses. Just seems like he's a real head case that they can't figure out.
He does. I feel for Todd Pletcher. Not that he needs much sympathy with the amount of races he wins, but this horse has to be really frustrating for him because he's obviously super talented. As you said, he seems like a perfect candidate to cut back in sprints. And early in his career, he had some success sprinting, but that didn't translate this year or this past year when he tried it a few times. He just didn't run very well. And, I guess that's how you have to ride him and just hope he holds on, but it's just not going to work very often on turf. I remember we had a horse like, obviously he had some of the same issues. He would just run off. He was good enough to hold on in California and win a lot of races, but he could never quite win in the biggest races. So I don't know what to do with a horse like Guido. Luckily, you'll notice in our figures, horses like him were responsible for a change we made a few years ago where we don't give full credit for super fast pace figures when horses run off like him. I think his final time figure was a 115. It only got bumped up a couple points in this field. So we don't overrate horses like that, I would say, very often, but just a real head scratcher. And for a guy like Todd Pletcher, who's really proven to be a good turf trainer these last couple of years, something he wasn't good at, I'm sure he's trying every trick he knows and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's got to be frustrating. I know Guido was successful in one of those one-turn mile races at Belmont Park last year. Maybe that's the only place he can do it because speed seems to be dangerous in those races. But yeah, he's got to be a frustrating horse for these connections. Well, we saw a bit of a changing of the guard with an improving 4-year-old in the Canadian turf. And I think we saw the same thing with the fillies and mares in the Honey Fox earlier on the card as Get Mother a Rose, who was nothing more than an average $40,000 maiden claimer for Tom Bush going back less than a year ago, has just completely turned her career around. He took a shot running her in the South Beach last time against some really good horses off some good sprint races last year in New York, but he tried stretching her out against around 2 turns. I had noted that she ran deceptively well in that race with a wide, uncomfortable trip, and the trip was completely different in this race. Junior Alvarado just did everything right, saved all the ground, sliced between horses at the top of the stretch, and she just ran away impressively at the end.
She did, and that was a great call you made on this horse. I did get to listen to your show Friday. I do believe I remember hearing about her, and I know that you picked her. Good effort. A pretty amazing story, as you say. It took her a while to break her maiden, even dropped down in the claimers a couple times. I think she actually broke her maiden in a maiden claimer, as you say. But sometimes when the light goes on, it just stays on, and that's the case with her. She got a nice 117 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. Obviously, the best of her career, and it came in her biggest win. And I don't think there was anything phony at all about this race. The pace wasn't overly quick, and she was able to run them down late with an impressive turn of foot.
Yeah, I thought the interesting thing about this race was that it was really dominated by horses coming out of mostly allowance and maiden races. I mean, Silver Kitten has really ascended quickly. She broke her maiden two back, won an allowance last time. Sister Hanan, who was third, she's another horse coming out of allowance races that stepped up. And the horses that had proven stakes form were just no-shows here. I mean, Valedictorian, it was probably a bad sign that she was going off at 9-2 in this race, because for her, that was just super dead on the board, and she didn't show up here. Same thing for Atomic Blonde, who got that perfect trip in the South Beach last time. So sometimes you see these improving 4-year-olds, and they just can surpass the proven stakes horses.
Yeah, especially when the stakes figures come in weak. And this one definitely for a grade 3 for older fillies and mares didn't look particularly strong, so it was ripe for the picking.
One race prior to that, we saw the 3-year-olds in action in the Grade 3 Palm Beach, going a mile and a 16th. And Vitalogy, who, to his connections' dismay, I know, was scratched out of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf last year off a deceptively strong performance, and he was second in the Bourbon leading up to that race, made his return here. His first start as a 3-year-old, showed some uncharacteristic speed racing as a chaser here, going after a horse that, again, sort of ran off on the front end. But he took over pretty early. Nevertheless, he held sway late over a horse that took a really good late run at him in Tiesto. And I just thought it was a really solid first start as a 3-year-old for this guy.
It was. If I remember, and my memory's not always great, I think we actually both liked this guy in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf before he was scratched. And he didn't make his way back to the races until now. But I was pretty impressed with the effort. I would expect a lifetime best figure from a 3-year-old, and he got that with a 105. But as you note, the one thing that really stood out to me was the new dimension of early speed. Not that they were going super fast up front. They weren't. We have a couple of fractions in blue. But oftentimes that doesn't matter to running style. Horses who are closers are just going to drop back regardless of the pace. And that wasn't the case with him. He showed he was able to stay up close. He was only a couple lengths off the lead after a half mile, and he finished strong. The final time was just 100 figure. He got a 105, and I thought he was really moving. And I thought all of the top 3 ran pretty well, actually, for just 3-year-olds. They all got a 105 or 104 TimeformUS speed figure in here. And maybe he got the jump on the closers, but that was tactics and a good ride, and his versatility now that he was able to be closer.
Yeah, I've become a fan of this horse. I just like his versatility. I think he's a really hard trier. He seems like this tiny little horse that just has a lot of fight in him. I mean, coming down the stretch, you could see him compared to Tiesto, who's this gigantic mammoth of a horse, was ranging up outside of him, but he still held him at bay. Tiesto, this was just his 3rd career start. I think he still has a forward move in him for Bill Mott, because he won his debut for this barn, which you don't always see in turf routes for Bill Mott. They took a shot in a stakes race in his 2nd start, a stakes race, the Awad last fall at Belmont, that I think is turning out to be a pretty strong race. And he stepped forward here, so I think you'll hear from both of these moving forward. I think this was going to be a productive race with horses coming out of it to run back. Let's move on to some non-stakes action that was run last week at Gulfstream Park, dialing it all the way back to Wednesday's card, where one of the most notable speed figures of the early part of the week was turned in a maiden race, as Bo Luminari, making his 3rd career start, broke through out of the maiden ranks with a 1-mile performance that achieved a pretty noteworthy speed figure.
Yeah, he got a 120 for the win. It kind of came out of nowhere. Looking at his past performances, you would never expect that. He beat a horse who has run pretty fast several times in his career, in Felix the Fox. He's my current leader. I always have kind of in the back of my head the fastest maiden in America. It's been his title for a while, though he disappeared. Amazing that he hasn't won for me. I remember we had a horse, Switzerland, for Steve Asmussen, who couldn't break his maiden and kept running in into really good horses and running super fast figures, and finally cracked through and won some stakes races. And I wouldn't be surprised if someday Felix the Fox winds up in stakes competition. But Beau Luminaire certainly will off of that effort. It was just a monster effort for Rudolph Brissett. He just destroyed the field, won by 7. He didn't go particularly fast early, but it wasn't slow. There's no blue fractions. And in just his third start, I don't know where this came from, but it was fast.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll say about it is that he had only sprinted up until this point. He was coming out of a race that seems like it's turning out to be pretty strong because that 6 furlong race that he returned in at the end of last year at Gulfstream Park, he was second to Fearless, that Todd Pletcher first-time starter who came back and just destroyed a field of allowance horses on the same day that Tiz the Law won the Holy Bull. So maybe that's just a stronger race than we initially thought. And apparently Beau Luminari just wanted to go long because he showed that same speed going a mile and just used his stamina to really carry it that extra 2 furlongs. He's got this really funny pedigree, an obscure pedigree by I Want Revenge out of a Scrimshaw dam. I don't think I see those 2 names in pedigrees barely ever, let alone together. So an interesting horse and an exciting one for Rudolph Brissett because based on this effort, it's not going to be too long before we see him in stakes races.
Yeah, good point about the pedigree. I couldn't tell you the last time I have seen I Want Revenge as a sire or Scrimshaw. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, and I was going to ask you about that.
On Sunday's card at Gulfstream Park, we saw a couple of performances that I want to take note of. One, of course, was, I think, highly anticipated as Hidden Scroll, who is one of the most polarizing horses on Twitter, made his return to the races now as a 4-year-old. Obviously, this is a horse who turned a lot of heads in his debut going back to last January. They put him on the Triple Crown Trail. It didn't work out for him. They put him away for a long time. His initial planned return to the races had to be aborted when he acted up in the gate. He behaved himself better this time, got out of the gate, and I mean, we've got to be honest. He wasn't facing a field of any quality here. I mean, he just towered over this group, but at least he won like a 1 to 5 shot should.
Yeah, that's about all you can say about the race. There was no competition at all. So as long as he showed up and behaved, he was going to win the race. He wound up with a 112 Timeform US speed figure. The final time, I think, was 116 officially, knocked down a little bit because of the slow pace. A couple things did impress me. Obviously, he did it super easily. He wasn't asked for everything. I don't know what that translates to figure-wise. Probably not much. But what I was most impressed with was when he broke, despite the pace being slow, Johnny Velasquez kind of took him in hand, didn't want him just going right to the front, and he took to it pretty easily, which wouldn't be as big a good a sign if the pace were fast. You would expect that, but it was slow, and he rated nicely. So that was the one good sign I take from it, in addition to just overall looking good and winning well. And you know, I have no negatives. It wasn't super fast, but I don't think that's what they were looking for here.
No, and I still think there is more to be learned about this horse. Is 6 furlongs ultimately going to be his best distance? I kind of highly doubt that. He doesn't look like a pure sprinter to me. He certainly doesn't move like a pure sprinter. He's got that big floating stride that kind of makes you think he'd want to go longer. But he does clearly have a lot of speed. As you said, they weren't intent on using it, at least in the first quarter mile of this race. John Velasquez sort of let him open up around the far turn here. And he really was under no encouragement through the stretch. I mean, I don't want to get carried away with saying horses could have run a lot faster, but he was geared down a bit at the end of this race. And as I said, he just has this beautiful way of moving. We'll see how good he ultimately turns out to be, because he did run legitimately fast speed figures last year. I know there are a lot of differing opinions about, all the hype about him turned out to not be true, and he was just never a good horse, it turns out. I don't believe any of that. I mean, he was really good last year. They just had some quirks that they had to work out with him, and they tinkered with his running style a bit, which didn't end up working out. I think letting him use his speed is definitely the way to go moving forward, and we'll see what kind of races they'll ultimately target and what kind of distance he's going to prefer. Is he the kind of horse that could be competitive in a race like the Carter, like the Met Mile? I don't think we know, but I'll be interested to find out, and I think he belongs in those races.
Yeah, he does. I personally would like to see him maybe take one more slower step before jumping right back in the top end. If he did, I'd probably bet against him just because he'll be overbet for sure. But to be clear, I'm a fan of this horse. I want him to see him do well. It was one of the races, probably the only race I watched on Sunday. I made sure to tune in to watch him, was rooting for an easy win, and he got it. So I want nothing but good things for the horse, and I hope that's what we get, because we never have enough good horses.
One more race that I want to quickly touch upon from Sunday's card is the race that took place right after Hidden Squirrel won. That was a maiden event going 7 furlongs for the 3-year-old fillies. And I think it's always noteworthy when Ian Wilkes sends out a first-time starter to win. And he did so with 4 Graces, who I was just really impressed by. She broke from the inside, took a ton of pressure all the way around the far turn, turned away the other speeds, got a pretty legitimate challenge from a closer who was getting a perfect trip, turned that horse away too. I just liked everything that I saw from this first-time starter.
I did as well. And as you say, what made it notable was Ian Wilkes. He doesn't often do very well with first-time starters, obviously by design. And not just that, he certainly doesn't usually have horses come out and show this kind of speed. As you said, she broke from the inside. She got challenged, but she also did it in a race with Red Fraction. So she was doing some real running up front, had plenty to hang on. She wound up with a 103 TimeformUS speed figure, upgraded a bit from the final time of 97 because of that pace. And just I thought this was a really impressive filly.
I agree, and I'll be interested to see if she improves out of this race like so many of Ian Wilkes' horses do. She's certainly got the pedigree to be a nice one. She is the little half-sister to McCracken, so there's definitely potential here, and I'm not going to be surprised if we see her in a race like the 8 Bells in a few months, because this is the kind of debut that you can really build upon for a horse like her. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where on Saturday their feature race was the Spring Fever, going 5.5 furlongs for the fillies and mares. And this was a fun, competitive little race. The big favorite was Break Even, who got caught up in a very fast pace up front, at least for the first quarter mile. But she backed out pretty quickly, as she didn't really return like herself here. But that was okay, because we had some horses who were more than willing to take up the mantle, especially Midnight Fantasy, who got the job done here for Joe Sharp. She feels like a horse that really benefited from this 5.5 furlong distance, because I'm not sure she wants to go a whole lot farther than that.
Yeah, and she definitely got a pretty good setup. I mean, these horses came flying out of there. When you have a horse like Amy's Challenge back in 5th, granted only a couple lengths off the lead, but she got outrun by 4 horses. They were moving, and our opening fraction is in red. I think it was Mount Brave, who's a very fast filly in her own right, had an opening quarter mile of 1:44, which is just flying. When you particularly consider it's just a 5.5 furlong race, the baseline is already a fast time for that distance. So to get that kind of number, they were flying, they were dueling, and it just set up really nicely for Midnight Fantasy. She's a horse who we had saw over the summer, run some good races, but when she showed up in December after a break, she ran a really nice 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure. I think she finished first that day, was DQ'd out of the win. She was, I would say, a bit disappointing last time, but I'm not one to be a big bounce theorist, as I say. But if ever there was going to be one, a lifetime top off a layoff, that's usually the spot you see it. And she took full advantage of the trip, rounded back into her best form that we saw 2 starts ago, and just a really good effort. And I also want to mention Amy's Challenge, who kind of showed a new dimension. Maybe she was just outrun for the lead and wanted to get it. It's hard to say, but I do like how she kept coming and made it a fight all the way to the wire.
Yeah, I was going to also mention the performance of Amy's Challenge, because I was really encouraged by this. She was disappointing first time off the layoff when she wasn't able to finish off that race a month ago. But this effort was much better, because she's never been a horse that's really liked to pass runners in the lane. And she did that really willingly here. I mean, she did get a good setup, but she also rated more kindly than she has in the past. The 5.5 furlongs for her is probably a little bit short. So I'm now interested to see where she goes from here, because it seems like she's perhaps rounding back into the better form that we saw from her early last year.
Yeah, and the other horse, I do want to keep an eye on Mount Brave because eventually she's going to catch a field without all this serious early speed and even break even off the layoff. Maybe she just wasn't quite ready for this. I know she was entered in a turf race at the fairgrounds and scratched out what looked like a much easier spot to me for this one, and maybe just found herself not quite ready for this kind of challenge first off the bench. I'm not going to write her off just yet.
Yeah, that could be. It had been a while since she was off, and that's a tough pace situation to come back in. But still, I think a lot of people were hoping to see better out of her. Earlier in the day, we saw a 6-furlong maiden race that came back really fast. That was for the 3-year-old fillies as well. And Edgeway, a first-time starter for John Sadler, ridden by Tyler Bays, just busted out of the gate from the rail. She took a real challenge at the top of the stretch. A horse ranged up alongside of her like she might go by, but Edgeway really dug in, turned her away, opened up again in the late stages of this race. I mean, this is going to be a stakes horse eventually because this was impressive.
Yeah, it was. She also broke from the rail like Four Graces did. I said she. Yeah, it is a she.
Yep.
Broke from the rail as Four Graces did, which I think is always a big thing with first-time starters. We see a lot of them have trouble inside. Handled it well. We do have all the fractions in blue, so she didn't have to fly to get that lead. But she wasn't going slow. Part of that reason they're in blue is because the final time figure was a 1:18. It was really quick. Just an impressive filly. She didn't surprise anybody. I think she went off the favorite in here first time out for John Sadler. Her overall figure was knocked down to a 110 because the pace just wasn't the same as the final time. But there's nothing wrong with a 110. We already talked about tonalist shape. I think that's the same exact number she got winning the Devona Dale. Not saying she's on that level yet. It's obviously a different level of competition and a different distance, but certainly a promising filly that I would expect we'd see in some of these stakes races at Oaklawn coming up.
Yeah, I mean, there are some good 3-year-old filly sprinters out there. There's that one for Bob Bafford, whose name is escaping me now, who's run some big figures out west. There's this filly. I'm not going to be surprised if Four Graces runs faster in a little while. So feels like a lot of these horses could be contesting those races, like either at Oaklawn or the Beaumont at Keeneland or the 8 Bells on Derby Day. Just seems like this could be a pretty interesting division if a lot of these horses continue to progress.
Yeah, and the one thing I want to mention, especially with a lightly raced horse like this, if you're looking for a filly or even a colt, doesn't really matter, to stretch out, you want to see more of the shape of the race that she ran, where it's a slower race early and gets faster as the race goes on. You don't want to see red figures and slowing down late. It's not a perfect system. There are going to be horses who buck the trends in both directions, but as a general rule, this is the kind of horse who probably wants more distance.
Yeah, we'll see. She does have a big sprint pedigree on the dam side. Her dam's actually a half-sister to the Lumber Guy, who was a good, I believe he was a New York bred years ago. I think he won the Vosburg, I want to say. He won one of those grade 1 races for Mike Hutchins. So we'll see. If she's by competitive edge, they've been really versatile, but definitely some sprint pedigree there on the dam side for Edgeway. Let's move on to Fairgrounds, where they ran a 3-year-old stakes race in the Black Gold on the turf, going a mile and a 16th. That was just dominated by 2 Godolphin runners for different trainers. It was won by Hieronymus for Brad Cox, who's now won 4 out of 5 starts in his career. He fended off Pixelate, who is going out for Mike Stidham. This race, I know the speed figure didn't come back that high. I'd imagine this was a difficult day to make speed figures on the turf. I mean, it always kind of is at the fairgrounds, given the way they time the races there. But I know this race went a lot faster than the race for older horses later in the card. But I can imagine why the speed figures kind of ended up going the other way, because the pace in that race for the older horses was just, I mean, it was just comically slow. But still, I think these 2 3-year-olds might be okay.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd have to look on the speed figures. My assistant does the fairgrounds generally, and he stepped up a lot and helped me out this weekend with what I talked about earlier. He got a 102 after a 114, but he won the race. I'm not going to be down on it because he didn't get the same kind of figure. That 114 came when he was winning by 9 lengths against pretty overmatched foes. I think he showed some grit in the lane, and not a whole lot more to say about him. I wouldn't bet him off this 102. I think he's a better horse than that, and he's probably somewhere in between that and that 114 we saw last time.
Yeah, and the runner-up Pixelate is another one. I know he was 6-1 in this race, but he's a horse that I'd be interested in moving forward. Again, he's another Godolphin-owned horse that he's going out for Mike Stidham. He's also coming out of that same AWOD Stakes last year that Tiesto also competed in that I mentioned from the Palm Beach. He's run a couple times since then, not always getting great setups, but I just think he's a horse that's shown some potential at different times, so I'd be interested to see how he progresses as well. Just a couple of horses that are worth watching. They've got to get faster to compete against top-level competition, but I think they both might have the ability to do it. We'll stay with that same division and move on to California, where they ran the Pasadena for the 3-year-old males going a mile on the turf. And Haribo for Jeff Mullins and Umberto Rispoli, who were a pretty dangerous duo on Saturday at Santa Anita. This horse got a great ride and trip, but he really stepped forward off his 2-year-old form.
He did. He got a nice 107 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. That's pretty solid for 3-year-olds this early in the year. We talked about Vitalogy earlier. He got a 105 for his effort. It was a strong pace. We have the half-mile coded in red, but it's not like the race completely collapsed. The runner-up was the pace setter. I was impressed with him as well. He actually got a 109 because of that pace. That would be smooth like straight for Mike McCarthy. So I thought both the top two ran very well in here. The others, not quite as good. There was a big gap between second and third, at least a few lengths, I think about 3 lengths. So the top two for me are both very promising.
Yeah, I agree with that. Smooth Like Straight ran a big race. I'm not going to argue with anybody that said maybe he ran the better race here because everything did go right for Haribo in this race. But Haribo's got a nice late kick on him. Smooth Like Straight. We'll see how far he ultimately wants to go. I know he won another 1-mile race, I think, at Del Mar last year. I want to say it was that Cecil B. DeMille. But he seems like a horse that might have some distance limitations. Haribo, we'll see. I think these are two decent horses, though. They're certainly running as fast as their East Coast counterparts, which doesn't always happen in these races out west on the turf. So a good group of horses that I think I'll be interested to see where they go in the future.
Yeah, and the good thing from a speed figure perspective is there were 2 other mile races on the turf. It can be a little tricky sometimes on turf with 3-year-olds. Sometimes you underrate them, sometimes you overrate them. But there was plenty of data to go on in this case and no problem with the figure making.
The most impressive performance that we saw on the turf on Saturday at Santa Anita was certainly turned in the last race of the day by the 4-year-old Originaire, who came off a few stakes races that he competed in going back to last year, was in allowance company here. Again, he's a horse that got the right setup, closing into a fast pace. But, I mean, this horse just really took off in the lane once Umberto Rispoli steered him out into the clear. He was flying through the late stages of this race.
He was. This is a horse that's run second in a couple grade 2s. I think he narrowly missed in the Del Mar Derby. And then in the Mathis Brothers Mile was a solid second. I think everyone was behind Mo Forza, if memory serves. But just this was his best effort yet, in my opinion. Just visually, figure-wise, he got 120, which I think he had run a 116 previously as his best. So just a really good effort. I think it's always worth taking note when a horse wins a turf race this easily. You don't see it often. And we've seen before the jump from allowance competition to stakes competition out in Southern California is not that big a deal. So I think he could pretty easily step up and be a stakes winner sooner rather than later. And great stakes winner at that.
Yeah, totally. And he's a horse that is a deep closer, so he needs to get the right pace set up. But he does have that really effective turn of foot. And Umberto Rispoli, I just want to give him a quick mention because he's been riding these races out in Southern California like he's been riding American races his entire life. I know he's a guy that rode in Hong Kong quite a bit. I think he was originally based in Italy. But I've really been impressed by what I've seen from him riding out in California. Just seems to have a knack for putting horses in the right position, saving ground, getting the right trips. I know that with all of these musical jockeys and with the agents that is going on now that John Velasquez has made a switch, he's not going to be with Ron Anderson anymore. But I'm hoping that he continues to get mounts because I like what I've seen from him.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine he wouldn't because he's riding as good or better than anyone out there right now. I'm not afraid to bet him on dirt or turf, but I really like him on turf. I think he sticks out there and is probably the best rider we have out in California right now on that surface.
Well, that's all the racing we're going to recap for this Tuesday podcast. Of course, you can always listen to us again on Friday when we do the TimeformUS forecast. And there's a lot to look forward to this upcoming week. We have 3 Derby prep races coming up. They are the Gotham, the Tampa Bay Derby, and the San Felipe out in California. I think well, hopefully they provide a lot more clarity in this picture as we march on towards the Kentucky Derby. But there'll be plenty of other great racing coming up this weekend. So, Craig, I'm hopeful we can talk about all of that on Friday. As always, you can listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Forum channel and listen to us on Tuesday and Friday. So thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back again to do some handicapping on Friday's TimeformUS forecast.